Hi everybody, and welcome to today's Cambridge University Press webinar. I'm Will, and I'll be moderating today's session along with my colleagues Julia and Sarah, who you can't hear at the moment, but I promise they are here. During the webinar, you'll be able to hear our speaker Samantha and to see her slides, but you won't be able to see Samantha herself. You won't need a microphone. If you want to ask a question, please just use the chat box, and I'll make sure that I'll make sure to ask Samantha at the end of her presentation during the scheduled Q&A session, question and answer session. The recording of today's webinar will be on our blog and on YouTube next week. You'll be receiving an email with your certificate of attendance after the webinar as well. So I'm very pleased to welcome Samantha Lewis as this afternoon's presenter. Samantha Lewis is a teacher trainer, and materials writer based in Spain. She's co-authored Interactive and Own It, a secondary course which focuses on learner autonomy. She's trained primary and secondary school teachers of English in Spain and has an MA specialising in English language teaching in secondary schools. So I'm going to pass it on to Sam. Welcome, Sam.
Hello, thank you very much, Will. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. It's lovely to see so many people joining. And as Will said, if during the webinar, if I ask a question and you'd like to participate, please just write your answer in the chat box. Okay, so we're going to be looking at how to encourage learner autonomy in the classroom. And we're going to be looking at two different things. So first of all, looking at the life skills our learners need to be effective autonomous learners, and also practical ideas for developing these skills and competencies. So thinking about our learners, the more responsibility they take and the more interest they have in their own learning and the more personalised it is, the better their learning will be. So after identifying these skills, as I said, which will help the learners take control of their own learning, we'll look at some practical ways that you as teachers can help them to develop them in the classroom. So let's have a think first of all about what learner autonomy means. And I found this quote by Professor Jack C. Richards, which summarises it quite nicely. So it says, learner autonomy refers to the principle that learners should take an increasing amount of responsibility for what they learn and how they learn it. So we've got these two ideas here about them taking more responsibility and then thinking about how they learn. So could I ask you, just as an introduction, to write which characteristics you would expect autonomous learners to show in your classroom? What things would you expect your autonomous learners to do? Okay, so let's have a look at some of the things that autonomous learners that we would expect them to do. So first of all, we would expect them to play a more active role in their learning, to be more involved in the whole learning process. We would also expect them to make decisions about their learning, so making their learning much more personalised and focused and therefore much more relevant to their needs. And finally, we might expect them to reflect on their learning and evaluate how successful their learning has been. And based on this reflection, decide what the next steps are in the learning process. So as you can see, it's very different from a traditional teacher-led way of learning. So now we're going to have a little think about who our learners are. And it seems to me that now we're not just teaching our teenage learners English. We're helping them to develop all different kinds of skills. Skills, for example, like creativity, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, digital literacy, and learning how to learn. And they're learning these skills in their other school subjects as well. So they're not just specific to learning a language, but they are all relevant in their own way in language learning. So basically, we're helping them become 21st century global learners. which is quite a lot for us as English teachers to take on. So where do we start? Well, in the Cambridge Life Competencies framework, they've actually divided these life skills up into two main groups. You can see here we've got at the top thinking and learning skills, and then the second group of skills are what they call social and emotional skills. So you can see all those different life skills there, organised into two groups. And different course books may integrate these life skills into their courses and break them down and include specific activities that learners can do in the classroom to develop these skills. And in terms of developing learner autonomy, even though all of these skills are fundamental to creating effective language learners, I've chosen 3 to focus on today. And I've chosen 3 which I feel are extremely relevant to the language learning context, but also those that perhaps our learners need most guidance from us as language teachers. So the 3 I'd like to look at today are learning to learn, critical thinking, and collaboration. And these areas I've put into a Venn diagram because they do overlap, and they're all highly relevant in terms of developing learner autonomy. So in terms of learning to learn, what we're doing is enabling our learners to become more aware of their learning preferences and strategies that work best for them, and helping them to take control of their learning. By thinking critically, learners are learning to think for themselves, so that makes them better equipped to make decisions about their learning and to reflect critically and evaluate the success of their learning. And by developing effective collaboration skills, what we're encouraging our learners to do is to take a more active role in their learning. So they're learning how to work together, learn from each other, and rely less on the teacher to become more independent learners. So we can see that all 3 of these skills contribute to creating a classroom where the teacher is more of a facilitator of learning rather than an instructor. So let's think about our first area, which is learning to learn. And if we want to help our students learn how to learn, then we can set up and maintain good or effective learning habits in the classroom. So it's all about setting up useful habits for our learners. These habits, or the way they use learning strategies, will help them to take control of their learning. So things like, for example, how to organise their notes, or how to record and recycle new language, or perhaps how best to approach a text or reflect on their learning. And it's not enough really for us to just introduce these strategies once to our learners and expect them to use them. We need to introduce them gradually and guide them how to use them again and again until they do use them automatically and they become able to choose the ones that best suit their individual needs and learning style. So for example, if we take the example of how to record vocabulary, we could teach our students to record new words using pictures, or making word roses or mind maps, perhaps grouping words in a table or a different type of graphic organizer. We may get them to record pairs of words with similar meanings or opposite meanings, or we may get them to use them in a sentence. So as your learners try out all of these different techniques, they will become more able to choose the ones that are most appropriate for them to use to record a particular vocabulary item. And as you know yourselves, every learner is different, and some ideas will work better for some learners than others. So it's really important to help them to try out different ideas and to decide or become aware of which ideas they prefer, their preferred, so they understand their preferred learning styles. So let's have a think about the things that we can do now in the classroom. So in order to develop effective learners, we want them doing all the work. So if we want our learners to play a more active role in their learning, we need them to be really active in the classroom. As I said before, we've moved away from a very traditional teacher-led classroom to include more participation from the learner. So this not only helps our teenage learners become more responsible for their learning, but it's more motivated for them. The more involved they are, the more interested they are, and the better they'll learn. So one way we can do this is through the way that we deal with language, with new language in the classroom. And I've divided it here into two areas of new language. So we can look at target and emergent language and all the ways that we record and recycle this language in the classroom. Just to clarify, by target language, what I'm referring to here are, well, the specific language that is taught, selected by either by the teacher or is selected within the course book, and is taught to the students as a new set of language. And that could come from a number of sources. It could come from a reading text or a listening text. It could come from a specific vocabulary exercise or a video. And it's usually a lexical set of related words. And in terms of emergent language, what I'm referring to there is all of the language that that arises or crops up during a lesson, either because students ask for it or that they need it in order to complete other activities. So usually unrelated words, but for me, very, very interesting language, because that's the language your students actually want to learn and need to learn. So it's really important to think about capturing that language during the class, recording it and recycling it. And so I've got here on the slide 3 different ways that I do this, 3 habits that I set up with my learners to capture and recycle this language. The first one I've called 3 before me. So this is a rule that I establish in class. And instead of the teacher becoming a walking dictionary every time the student wants to know a new word, they have to ask 3 other students before they ask me. And there's a couple of reasons why I think this is effective. The first one, because the students who are actually explaining the new words to each other, they have an opportunity to recycle language they've already learnt, to retrieve those words from the back of their memories, and to develop the skill of explaining words to their peers. And obviously, the students who are learning a new word from each other are finding ways of becoming independent and learning that doesn't just rely on the teacher. So they're becoming more independent as well. Obviously, there will be times when they don't know the word. So I would then feed the word in, tell them what the new word is, and make sure that the word is written on the board in the classroom. But I prefer not to write the word on the board myself. I prefer to ask my student to come up to the board and to write the new word. So I'll spell it for them. And by writing the new word, by them listening to me spell the word and write the word, they're actually working on that sound spelling relationship, which is so complicated in English. And at the beginning of the school year, you'll find that they'll make lots of mistakes with the spelling and that you'll need to correct it. But as the year goes on, they become far more confident and better spellers and able to sort of understand a word and listen to how it's spelt and write it correctly. And so all of this emergent language is put onto the board and built up during the class. But then what's really important is what you do with that language at the end of the class. So we don't want to just wipe the board and clear away the language without recording it. And there's a couple of ways that you can record this new language. So here where I've said your new word, or it could be your new words, because different students in your class will have learnt different new words, some of the words will be new for some students and other words will be new for other students. So you can encourage them to perhaps keep a part of their notebooks to build up their own personal dictionary. So again, they'll write down the words that are new for them and then choose the best way to remember those words. So again, recycling those learning strategies, either drawing a picture, writing a definition, putting the word into a mind map, or using a translation. And then what you can do, another thing you can do as well, is to use vocabulary cards and bags. And I'm sure many of you have used vocabulary cards. They're very easy way to record and recycle new language in the classroom, and I find that they're really, really useful in terms of personalizing new language and creating a student-generated task that you can use throughout the school year. So really, really good resource. I'm going to show you a couple of examples. So here are a couple of examples of vocabulary cards. So you can see in terms of teacher preparation, it's very minimal. All you need to do is to take in some pieces of card that are cut up, and the students would write a definition or draw a picture on one side of the card, and then they would write the words on the other. So I'm sure if you look at those, you can guess what the two words are in these cards here. So here, as you can see, we have watermelon and jellyfish. And just a couple of things to bear in mind with these cards. They're student generated, but they can also think about perhaps recording the pronunciation. So you can see they've put a little red dot over the stressed syllable on watermelon. They can include the part of speech after the word. So you can see they're both nouns. And then as a teacher, you have also a great opportunity to work on definitions and help them to correct definitions. So there's been a little bit of correction here in the jellyfish definition. So corrected to it has electricity in its legs instead of in the legs, which is a very common mistake by students. But also there are another couple of things that could be corrected. An animal there at the beginning of the definition, or for the watermelon, it's a fruit, it is big outside and it is green inside. So there you've got a few opportunities to help students to correct their definitions. So if I look at the next couple of definitions here, again, you can have a go at trying to guess what the words are here. Okay, so here they are. So we've got magician and wild, and you can see here the student has even made an attempt to include the pronunciation there in wild. Okay, and then what I do is I just collect them up into a plastic wallet or an envelope and use them to play all sorts of games that students enjoy, things like Pictionary, miming games, Taboo, where they take a card and they have to explain the word without saying the word, so that develops that really useful speaking skill. Or you can get more creative. You can choose 2 words and get them to put the 2 words into a sentence, or choose 3 or 4 words and get students to create a story based on the words. So there are all sorts of things that you can do with these word cards, which you can use as games, maybe at the beginning of the class or at the end of the class. And it's a great way of them recycling the new language. Okay. Just going to think about another way now that we can develop Learn to Learn by using a variety of learning techniques. So if our aim is to help our learners to become more autonomous, they need to make decisions really about the kinds of strategies that will help them approach each task in the most effective way. So as we said earlier, we need to introduce students to a range of Learn to Learn techniques and then guide them how to use these over and over again until they're able to use them automatically and select the best ones for their individual needs. We've also already mentioned things like teaching them different ways to record vocabulary and then identifying which one would be the most appropriate to use in a certain class. But there are other strategies which you often see developed in English courses, like how to read a text for gist, how to read a text for more detailed understanding, how to infer the meaning of a new word from the context, or with a listening activity, how to develop different listening skills. I've chosen an example of a learning to learn skill that I particularly like because you don't often see this one developed in course books, and I think it's a really important one. So this is teaching students how to work in pairs. And it says right at the top, you know, when you work in pairs, you learn from your partner. So it's also encouraging that idea of the students learning from each other, so becoming more independent and less dependent on the teacher. And you can see it's a very simple task for quite a low level, but basically to begin with, what they do is they look at all of these good practices to use in the classroom, and they complete them with always or never. So things like always listen to your partner, always answer your partner's questions, never speak at the same time as your partner, always help your partner with words they don't know, never laugh at your partner's mistakes, and always ask questions to get more information. So first they think about the good habits and the strategies for working with a partner. And then the next task they have to do is to put these strategies into practice so they have a conversation with their partner. It says ask and answer questions with the partner, and that could be about things that they like doing or likes and dislikes. So they'll be asking each other questions like, do you like hanging out with your friends? Yes, I do. Me too. And then at the same time, they're practicing those strategies of asking questions, listening carefully. And then afterwards, what this exercise encourages them to do is to really evaluate what they've said to each other and then feed back to the class by completing these sentences. So they are really processing what they've said to each other. So rather than a typical pair work exercise where they're talking in English but not really listening to each other, I think this stage is really important in terms of giving them a little processing task and reporting back to the class task at the end to show that they really did listen to each other during the activity. Okay, moving on now to another couple of skills that we can encourage our learners to do in order to develop their learning to learn skills, and they are identifying goals and reflecting on their learners. So this is one example that can be used to get students to think about what they're going to be learning. Okay, and this is called a KWL chart. So has anybody used one of these charts with their students before? I'm afraid I can't actually see any of your responses, unfortunately. Let me just move down and see. Okay, so basically K will stand for what I know, W will stand for what I want to know, and L for what I have learnt. And this is a very simple way that you can personalize what students want to learn and then help them to reflect on their learning afterwards. So I use this either at the start of a new unit in a course book or before a project. You could use it at the beginning of a project. So if they were doing, I don't know, a project based on festivals, for example, festivals around the world, first you get students to complete the column what I know. So they would write down all the information and ideas that they already know about the topic. And then this middle column is interesting because that's when they think about what they want to know about the topic. And you could perhaps get them to write it down as questions. And then, so this will be completed before they begin, the first two columns. And then at the end of the project or at the end of the topic, they would look back at these questions and decide which can be answered. And then think about any other new information or new skills that they've learnt during the project and reflect on what they've learnt as a result. So it's a very nice way of personalizing those two skills of setting objectives and reflecting. Another way you can approach this is by using a chart like this one for self-assessment. So in this particular example, students are actually given the areas that they have to reflect on. And here you can see they're almost written as can-do statements. I can name 13 sports in English. I can use 12 sports verbs to talk about sports. And as you can see here, these aims or these objectives are very much focused on the target language in that particular coursebook unit. And so what they would do, or what you could do as a teacher, is you could add extra objectives to this. So as well as objectives that focus on target language, you could also include objectives that focus on perhaps the skills that they've learned how to do, perhaps they've learned how to develop a new style of writing, or perhaps they've learned how to make decisions within their group. And you can add those as well to your lists. And then in terms of the reflection, obviously what the students do is they have to think about each of these areas and decide how well, for example, they can name 13 sports in English. If it takes them a long time to think about it, obviously they would circle the sad face. If they did it very, very quickly, the happy face, etc. But I think what's important again with something like this is what we do with this afterwards. So when we're thinking about reflection, we can always think about 3 stages, if you like. Stage 1, students thinking about what they've learned. So we've got that here in this list. And then stage 2, how successful is this learning? So depending on which face they've circled, that would determine how successful their learning was. And then stage 3, what's next? So here they're kind of thinking about evaluating their learning and perhaps thinking of a series of personalized action points. So in this particular example, if they found that they could think of 13 sports in English very, very easily, perhaps a learning point for them or an action point for them would be to then extend their knowledge of sports in English and maybe create a word rose or a mind map which included more sports in English or more unusual sports in English. Or perhaps if they circled the sad face next to I can use comparative adjectives to compare 2 things, they may feel that they're not able to use that language very successfully, so they may need to do some more controlled language practice there. And then they could always summarize their action points in a little summary, a little paragraph, or perhaps tell the teacher. Okay. This is another type of reflection chart, which you can use with when you're dealing with project work. This is one that helps students, I think, focus on each stage of the project and identify and then reflect on the objectives of each of those stages. So one of the challenges that I've found with using project work with teenagers is trying to keep them focused on the task during each stage and using as much English as possible. So what I've tended to use now is with project work to break it down into the different stages, and for each stage give students a little chart like this in which they first think about the skills that they need to use in terms of speaking or writing, so the spoken output and the written output of that stage of the project, and any other skills. And then at the end, when they finished at the end of this particular stage of the project, they would evaluate themselves, evaluate their performance in terms of how successfully they felt they completed each of these skills. Now, for example, because some skills, such as giving ideas and making suggestions, will probably be repeated in a later stage of the project, then if they didn't feel happy with their evaluation, with their success there, at least they're getting another opportunity to do this again later on in the project. And we could refer to these different areas as success criteria. And you can see here for just this one particular stage, this was for a short film project that I ran with my students. This was given to them just before they started to write the dialogue for each of the scenes. And you can see there are only 5 things to focus on, but I think that's plenty. So you don't want to include too many things that students are focusing on. And also they need to be written in language that your students are going to understand very easily. And then depending on the level of your students, before they begin each stage, If you want them to, for example, listen to everyone's ideas and agree and disagree, then first you need to check that they know what kind of language they can use to do that. And if they don't have the language, then obviously that's the time for you to feed that language in. And then obviously at the end of the stage, then they would use the evaluation key to evaluate their progress. And I think this way it keeps students focused on the whole process of project work rather than simply focusing on the final output. Okay, in terms now of thinking about how to develop critical thinking, as we said earlier, if our learners are thinking critically, they're more likely to be thinking for themselves, which means that they'll be better equipped to make decisions about their learning and evaluate the success of their learning. So we need to kind of look for opportunities in the classroom to encourage critical thinking and think more about their learning and understand how successful their learning is. Obviously, the more the learners can think for themselves, the more autonomous they're going to be. So one way we can develop these critical thinking skills is ensuring that our learners are always thinking. So exploiting every single opportunity in the classroom for our learners to be thinking and to be able to think for themselves. And one practical way we can deal with this is by thinking about the questions that we ask our learners in the classroom. So, for example, just the types of questions that we ask can really influence the range, length, interest, and the quality of language
Hi everyone, can you still hear Sam? Can you just say yes or no in the questions box? Okay, all right. Okay, hopefully she'll be back on in a second. Hi everyone, really sorry about this. Just bear with us for a sec. We're just waiting for Sam to come back online. Sorry about the wait. Looks like she's just coming back online now.
Okay. And hopefully you should be able to see me now, is that correct? You see the screen?
Yeah, we can hear you now, Sam, loud and clear.
Okay, I'm really sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Okay. So, going back to what we said about the questions, I don't know at what point I got cut off, but basically the idea here is thinking about the type of questions that we use in class and how that can influence the language that our students produce. So if we're asking questions about pictures, using pictures in class, obviously we can ask our students what they can see in the picture. It's a very typical kind of question. We can ask them about an image. And really what they'll be doing is just describing what they can see. But we can take them a step further and we can ask them perhaps questions which get them to think about themes in the picture or wonder about different issues relating to the picture. And what these questions do is they obviously require more thought from the students and will help them to improve their general thinking skills and to think for themselves. Okay, so let's see an example of this, how we can set this up in class. So here, for example, we have a picture, lots going on, it's very colourful, lots of things to describe, and typical questions that we might ask about this picture, sorry, are those that you can see here. So for example, what can you see and what are they doing? So these are sort of the questions that we often ask students about a picture, which are fine. But they only really get the students to describe what they can see in the picture. So in terms of language production, they are fairly limiting and predictable. They're just going to describe the clothes they can see, the colours, the materials, and the position of the people in the picture. So we could almost say that there's a right or a wrong answer to these questions. And we pretty much know, or we can predict what the students are going to say before they answer. So what we could do is, with the same pictures, we can think about changing our questions so that they have to think a little bit more about the answers. So I've got a few examples here that you could use. So for example, here they could choose two of the people in the picture and imagine the conversation between them. Or they could just imagine why they are there and answer the question, why are they in that picture in the first place? So really sort of reflecting on some of the reasons why they think they're in the picture. They could also encourage their creativity, their imagination, and imagine there's somebody in the picture and what they're looking outside and describe what they can see outside the picture. Or we can encourage them to be comparing, evaluating, and choose a person or something in the picture and talk about in which ways they are similar or different to the person in the picture, or in which ways things in the picture compare to a similar thing in their lives. So we're taking them beyond just what they can see and encouraging sort of more deeper thinking and longer terms of more meaningful interaction. Okay, another really useful way of encouraging students to engage in more meaningful interaction, really think about what they're saying, is to include a sense of achievement in the questions we ask. And we can do this very easily by adding a specific number to questions. So, for example, if I ask my students, why do people do extreme sports? They may just turn around and answer because they like it. And in all fairness to them, they will have actually completed the task, but with a very, very limited response. So if we add a specific number to that question and change it here into a statement, so we've got think of 3 or more reasons why people do extreme sports. We are encouraging them to interact with either by themselves or with another person, and to give them a sense of achievement when they have actually thought of 3 reasons. So we don't want to make that number too high. It's got to be achievable. But if we add the or more to that task, we're also not restricting the more able learners. So if they can think of more reasons, then they're able to do that, and they're still achieving the task with however many reasons they come up with. Another one we can do is with a time limit. So time limits are a really useful way of including a task, if you like. So for example, here we can use an online stopwatch. Oops, sorry, just flick back to there. So if you are interested in using classroom time as a really useful way with teenage learners to keep them on task, this is a really good one to use. I put the web address at the bottom, onlinestopwatch.com. And for example, if you were working on question tags, for example, as a language activity, you could give your students a minute to think of how many sentences they could write before this question tag. They could do it individually or together. And again, when they get to the end of the minute, they have achieved the task with however many sentences they come up with. Okay, another way we can encourage our learners to think is by getting them to train their brains. So thinking of all those little brain training games that really help to improve their ability to sort of observe and understand the world around them. So improving overall memory skills, which will help them in terms of learner autonomy, understand their preferred learning styles as well, the way they learn best. So independent learners obviously need to be observant and looking at things and taking in information and thinking about it if they're going to think for themselves. And a really easy way to do this that you can do in any class in order to prove their memory skills is with pictures as well. So you can show them a picture like this one or any picture. It could be an image from their course book, or it could be a picture that you bring into class. And you get them to look at it for a few seconds. And then you take away the image, or they close their books and they tell their partner as much as they can remember as possible about the picture. So this is something you could do at any point in the class just to refocus students. So I'm going to take away this picture, and obviously the task you would give to your students would be the following. What was in the picture? Tell your partner. So I'd like you now to just, in the questions box, write down all the things that you can remember from that picture I just showed you. Okay, I'm going to show you the picture now again. And really, the main objective here is not to extend your learners' vocabulary of all the fruits and vegetables in English, but to improve their memory skills and their powers of observation. And as I say, it's a very simple activity to do. It's motivating for teenagers. And as I say, you can do it at any point in the class. You could also flash pictures very quickly or show them from a different angle. So trying to get them to also see things from another perspective. Okay, and another way around this as well, we could also do this with our rubrics or instructions. So you could, for example, show your instructions upside down to an activity. So this is a fun way of giving short instructions, so training students to see things from a different perspective. Teenagers like that kind of element of the unexpected too. Perhaps not something you would do every class, but from time to time it can really be effective. I wouldn't recommend doing any more than 1 or 2 sentences either. It gets a bit difficult to read more than that. But they do enjoy little sort of observation tasks. Another thing you can use in class, which they really enjoy, are using puzzles. So thinking about using things like anagrams or word snakes or code games. So I've got a few examples to show you here. Okay, and learners really enjoy doing these kind of games. They're a great way of recycling language, but also developing their thinking skills as they've got to work out different codes or find words hidden in puzzles. And by giving your students a choice of activities, you're also giving them an opportunity to make decisions, asking them which ones they feel they're better at. So they could try out different styles of puzzles and then think about which ones they prefer doing and why, and what does that say about their learning styles. And then you can also encourage them to create their own puzzles. So you could perhaps set up a classroom activity with lots of student-generated puzzles to choose from, and you give them a time limit to go around the class and do as many as possible. And then think about what kind of puzzles they enjoy doing most. And that in turn will help them to see perhaps the best ways that they like to learn. And as I say, these are student-generated activities, can also become quite a nice or an interesting type of homework task to motivate your students, and also getting them to work on their English outside the classroom. Okay, the final thing that I'd like us to think about in terms of developing critical thinking skills is getting our students to solve problems. So problem solving, when students are solving problems, they're developing lots of skills at once, not just critical thinking skills, but they've got to think about the problem from different perspectives. They might need to apply creativity to think outside the box, obviously collaboration and communication as they work together to come up with solutions. So problem solving really helps our learners to become more autonomous and gets them to really sort of start to think for themselves. So I've got a little problem for you to think about. And this is a problem that involves a crow. Now, I don't know if you know this, but crows are known for being extremely intelligent birds, and they're known for their problem-solving skills. So, for example, when a crow encounters a really mean human, it will teach the other crows how to identify that person. And apparently, they never forget a face. So, if you ever come across a crow, make sure you smile. So in terms of problem solving, I've just created this little problem here. We have a crow, and we're going to imagine now that there's a nut, and crows absolutely love nuts. They love eating nuts, but obviously they don't have nutcrackers. And if they did, they wouldn't necessarily know how to open the nut and use they wouldn't know how to use the nutcracker. So how do they solve the problem? Okay, well, we can use this technique, which is called think, pair, and share. So first, you would encourage your students to think of 3 or more ways that the crow can eat the nut. So this could be individual, so you're giving learners a chance to reflect on the problem, think of ideas by themselves, and also, you know, you've got your little sense of achievement in there by saying 3 or more ways, so you're giving them something to aim for. And then when they've thought of a few ideas, you could then encourage them to share their ideas with a partner, and then finally choose the best idea. So there you're encouraging them again to listen to each other, evaluate each other, and what each other is saying, what they're saying to each other, and to choose the best solution. Now, if I told you that the solution actually involves some traffic lights, I wonder if any of you out there have managed to work out how the crow solves the problem. Has anybody managed to think of a way they could do that? Okay, well, let's have a look at the solution, because it's difficult for me to see actually what you're saying. But I can show you here the solution. So basically, they solve the problem by developing an ability to read traffic lights. So they wait for the red light, they place a walnut in the road or drop a walnut from a great height, and then they wait for a car to drive over the nut, wait at the side of the zebra crossing, and then when the traffic light changes, they walk across the zebra crossing safely to eat the nut. And there's actually a video online that you can go and watch and see how they do this, and you can share that with your students. But I just use this as an example because it's not necessarily coming up with the right solution that's the most important thing here, but just taking students through that whole process of problem solving and coming up with possible solutions and working together and discussing how good their solutions are in terms of developing their thinking skills. Okay, just to finish off with now, I'd like to have a quick look at this skill of collaboration in the class. So if we want our learners to be actively involved in the classroom, not always looking towards the teacher as the main source of knowledge, but learning from each other, then we need to get them obviously collaborating. And in terms of learner autonomy, thinking about making them more independent in the classroom. So we already saw with the previous, so in terms of getting them to pool ideas and work together, we already saw in that previous activity, how we're going to encourage them first to think by themselves, but then share their ideas and collaborate together. So this is a very, very simple way of getting students to pool ideas and work together, which you can apply to any kind of discussion activity. And then I've got this activity here as well, which can be used before, perhaps before some receptive skills work. So this particular example I've used many times, but this one is for before students read a text about Australia. And it's very simple it's a very simple idea, but basically you take a piece of paper, divide it into 4 triangles, and in the top corner of each triangle, write something you want the students to think about beforehand. And then up to 4 students sit facing one of the triangles. And again, you give them a time limit. And within that time limit, what they will do is write down all of their ideas that they have about that topic in the time limit. Then afterwards, what they do is called the carousel of ideas, because then it turns like a carousel and the student is then focusing on a different triangle. Again, we give them a time limit. Sorry, again, move ahead. We give them a time limit. And then within that time limit, they would read the ideas in front of them and add new ones. And then, so you repeat this process. So in little under 5 minutes, basically you have a whole page full of ideas that have come from the students. And then they can share, they can use these ideas, and you could effectively create a student-generated task where they then go on to read the text and decide how many of their ideas are actually in the text. And they'll be much more motivated to read the text if they're looking for their own ideas. So here we're really kind of getting them more involved in their own learning and working more independently with the text. Sort of related to this, in terms of getting students to learn from each other, we obviously want to look for opportunities for them to teach each other things in the classroom, and not just the stronger students in terms of language skills teaching the weaker students, but just from their life experience, teaching each other things. So for example, with that Australia text, we can give them just a very simple idea here, a line with at the top, I know a lot, and at the bottom, I know a little. And then individually, they would write what they know about Australia. And then they would mingle in class, and they could go around. If they don't know much about marsupials, they could perhaps find somebody who knows lots about kangaroos or koalas, and that person could teach the other what they know. Okay, I'm going through this quite quickly now because we're running out of time. But again, that's a very simple idea you could use. Peer teaching is is just a way of lifting an activity off a page. So in terms of, for example, here we have a definitions to word matching activity. Instead of just doing this in the course book, you can divide it up, perhaps write the definitions on individual cards, which you could place around the classroom, and give students different words they have to look for. So they would walk around the classroom, try and find their definitions, write them down, and then they would come back and teach each other their definitions. And then at the end, you would follow up with some activities or games to check that all of the students understood all of the words. And finally, if we want to get our students to listen to each other and give feedback, so we want to reduce dependence on the teacher and include more active participation, they do need guidance and support with this, but we can again give them little tick boxes, checklists. So for example, this is giving feedback on a reading activity. They would follow a model and analyse how well in the model the person has written about the topic, etc., etc. And then they would use a similar idea with their partner. As you can see here. Also, in terms of project work, we can think of different ways of students evaluating and giving feedback on other groups' outputs during project work. So if it's spoken output for an oral presentation, for example, we can get students to ask questions to the people who are watching that they have to answer as they watch. Or, for example, if it was a written poster, groups could write questions for other groups to answer about their poster as they look at the information. And then here, for example, if it's a written output, what you would then ask the students to do is to evaluate all of the examples in the class and choose the ones that they liked best and to give the reason why. Okay, so we've had a look at developing ways of learning to learn, developing ideas for critical thinking and collaboration in order to develop more learner autonomy in the classroom. And I think now what I'd like you to do is just quickly reflect on your learners and perhaps think about 3 different techniques or activities or ideas that you've listened to today that would be most relevant to your learners to help them to take more responsibility for their learning that you'd like to take away and use with your students in class. So I've just got a little reminder here. So for you to think about which 3 ideas you would most like to use with your learners. Okay, and I would just like to apologise for the technical issues that we've had there. But if anybody has any questions, please go ahead, and I think Will is going to ask me some questions now.
Hi, Sam.
Hi.
That was really, really interesting indeed. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
Lots and lots of ideas. I hope we've had lots of comments here. I think yeah, everyone's really happy with that.
That's good. It was difficult because I couldn't actually see what people were saying, but
okay.
So if you have some questions now, that would be good.
I do. Yeah. So we've had lots and lots of questions. Some of them sort of a few questions are sort of repeating themselves via lots of different people. So I'll go into the first one. So firstly, it goes back to when you were talking about dealing with emergent language in class. And a few people are asking how, but we've tried to do that. How do you know exactly what language to focus on in class? Because obviously they're coming out with all sorts of things out of their mouth, and how do you know which elements of what they're saying to focus on?
Well, when I was talking about it earlier, there are 2 reasons really why this emergent language will come up, and it could be because they don't know the word and they're asking you specifically for it. Or it might be because they need the word to complete a task or another kind of activity, and you'll hear them as you're monitoring that they're not using that word correctly. So that will be a word that would just crop up. Or perhaps it could be, you're reading a text together, or you've been watching a video and there's some language in there that somebody in the class doesn't know. And I think what's important as well to think about with emergent language is it's not necessarily the same for all students. So for some students there will be new words that they don't understand, but those words might be known by other students, which is why it's important to get all of this language on the board as much as possible, and for students to create their own sort of personal dictionaries where they're recording the new words for them and the words that they want to learn, And also with the vocabulary cards, you can use those to pin down some of that emergent language and recycle it. And if you then find that most of the class know the words in the word bag, you can get rid of those cards, take them out and replace them obviously with new words that come up.
Yeah, great, thanks Sam. So another question we've had is, so actually a few times we've heard this question come up. What do you advise with using in regards to using these techniques in larger classes? So you've got 30+ students.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think most of them can be used with large classes. Is there one in particular that they feel? I mean, for example, I'm just thinking about here with the vocabulary cards, they can be used with large classes. The reflection charts, the know, want, learn, the KWL chart.
Yeah.
The one for pooling their ideas, so the carousel of ideas, there they do need organising into groups of up to 4 students, so you'd have one piece of paper for each 4, up to 4. For example, peer teaching, we had to rush through that really quickly, I'm really sorry about that, but with peer teaching you'd have your definitions on the walls around the class, and then you would maybe have 3 groups of students, so students A, B and C, and they would be looking for different definitions each, and then you would need to regroup the students, so there's an A, B and a C in each new group. So when dealing with larger classes, all it means is that your instructions need to be really, really clear, and just check that every student knows. So, you know, hands up who's student A, hands up who's student B, hands up who's student C, right, and telling them exactly what part of the classroom they need to move to, and just making sure that you check your instructions so they all know what they're doing beforehand.
Okay, great, thanks Sam. So another question that came up was, how can you encourage learning beyond the classroom? So how can you make the students want, you know, intrinsically to go outside of that classroom and continue learning on their own?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you can definitely set them more interesting homework tasks. So, for example, as you said, you know, it could be the example in today's webinar, creating one of those puzzles to recycle language. They could go away and each do one of those, or you can find out, you know, what they're interested in. If they're, I don't know, if they're interested in watching any TV series, well, then encourage them to find one where they can watch maybe part of it in their own language and then watch the same part again in English, or watch it with the subtitles. If they're interested in music, getting them to use things like lyrics training to listen outside the classroom. If they have a particular, what's quite nice is them researching an area and then coming into class and teaching somebody else how to do that. So kind of preparing that outside the class. So I mean, like there's kind of little YouTube videos where you learn about something, or you learn how to do something. Them preparing that outside the classroom and then bringing it into class, and then becoming a YouTube presenter, if you like, to the class, and teaching the rest of the class about something that how to make something, or something that they wouldn't necessarily know about. Okay,
brilliant. And so you spoke about peer learning, peer assessing. Is there something you can do if you happen to see a pair of students who were discussing something together, or they're reflecting on their learning in some way? And I suppose this doesn't have to be sort of exclusively towards learner autonomy, but what can you do if one of those 2 students is clearly sort of sitting and doing a lot of listening, and not actually sort of proactively involved in that conversation? Have you got any advice for that?
I think perhaps one thing you can do when you set up the task is so kind of giving those, do you remember we talked about sort of giving that extra element to the end of a discussion task, whereby they've got to evaluate what they've said to each other and then come up with the best solution, or the best 3 solutions, or the 3 action points that they have in common, or something, so that they actually have to not only listen to each other, but then say, okay, you said this, I've said this, now we need to decide together what are the 3 best ideas that we've come up with, or how are we, in which 2 ways are we similar, or in which 2 ways are we different, something like that. So it's giving them a little task to achieve that actually encourages them to process what they've said to each other and discuss it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, we're getting there's a lot of questions of people coming in asking about before and after the teenage years. So you've been predominantly obviously focusing on teens here. Are these techniques also relevant for younger learners and for adults as well?
Some of them are definitely relevant for, I've used as primary learners as well. I think in mainstream education as well, the KWL charts, they're used, KWL, yes, they're used with primary learners. Also vocabulary cards, they can be used with any age group. And also all of those techniques about, you know, with getting them to try and ask each other. I mean, obviously, when I say primary, I'm talking more sort of mid to upper primary. You know, once they can write and they can communicate a little bit with each other.
Okay.
In terms, yes, I think a lot of them can be used. I mean, perhaps sort of identifying their own objectives in terms of thinking about like the success criteria. They will need a lot more support with that the younger they are, but I think certainly very valid for adult learners as well, and getting them to reflect on their progress and the success of their learning afterwards.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question. I've got to ask it. It's a really, really interesting question, actually. Are you ready, Sam?
I'm ready.
You're ready. Okay, so how do you get students to be objective when they do a self-assessment chart or a self-evaluation activity? Is there any way of objectifying that?
That's a really difficult one. Well, I mean, I think the example that we looked at where it was just focusing on the language that they'd learned in the unit, so it's like focusing on the vocabulary that they'd learned. Being objective, I mean, I suppose it's kind of thinking, okay, as you thought about how many words that you could remember, how quickly did you do that? Or, you know, did it take a long time? Or did your partner answer most of the, if they did it together, you know, helped each other? And so if they did it very quickly, then they can see that they, you know, that's quite a fair assessment that they tick the very smiley face that they are able to do that. But if they took longer to then maybe think about why it took them longer and how they could help themselves then in the future to remember new language in the unit. I also think that often students can be quite critical of themselves and almost like sort of think that they're not as good as they are. So you might find that happening as well. So yeah, but I think you just have to sort of make sure that as a teacher you're monitoring and giving them that support and having that conversation afterwards as well to help them with that.
Right. Okay, well, thanks very much, Sam. I think we'll leave it there. So thanks very much to Sam for her webinar, and thanks everyone else for listening as well. Sorry we run a little bit over. So this webinar is going to be available to re-watch on our YouTube channel next week. So go to Cambridge University Press YouTube channel, and it will be on there if you want to re-listen or re-watch this. Also, I wanted to let you all know that if you're looking to develop life skills in your teenage students, in September we're going to be releasing a series of podcasts, primarily aiming at giving teachers these techniques, similar to what Sam's discussed actually today, for developing a whole range of life skills, so collaboration, communication, etc. So listen out for those. You'll be able to get them at cambridge.org/WOBL, that's wobble. Yeah, so listen out for those. Thanks again to Sam. Thanks for everyone for listening, and have a lovely day.
Thank you.